Now, though, we're going to stick on Weinstein and continue to discuss this trial with our guest here today, Dr. Ziv Cohen, forensic psychiatrist. Dr. Ziv, you're New York-based, and I know you have extensive experience in sex crime cases. Thank you for being here today.
Great to be here.
We're excited to break down this trial with you. I know you have a history of breaking down and talking about a lot of witness testimony in these sex crime cases. And we've heard from many of these accusers. We've heard from multiple women now through the prosecution's case. Talk a little bit about them testifying, how that is for them, how hard it is for them, and also how they have to recall things with memory and describe these encounters.
So testimony when you're the victim in a sex crimes trial is one of the hardest things that a person could go through. I've talked to many victims who have had to testify in their trials, and this is something that people are going to remember decades later in their lives, particularly if the outcome is not what they wished for. So if the person is not found guilty, then that will really leave the victims with the feeling that the jury did not believe them. But we can imagine that talking about the worst day in your life, talking about being sexually assaulted in an open courtroom in front of so many strangers is hard enough. But you also are aware that as a victim that the jury is supposed to listen to you with skepticism. They're not there to just take you word for word. They're not your friends. They're there to render impartial justice. So it's a very stressful experience for the victims.
And we've seen many of these females get very emotional. Yesterday we saw Jessica Mann. She broke down. She had to stop altogether and they had to pause. How does the jury receive all of that, as you said, emotional and that display, really?
So, the emotion can have a variety of effects on the jury, and the defense and prosecution are going to look at it a little bit from different angles. From a prosecution perspective, if the victim is showing appropriate emotion and appropriate intensity of emotion, then that's very positive because it lends the victim credibility. So in that sense, emotion is an ally, and it can also elicit empathy from the jury rather than someone talking about what happened in a very robotic, detached way. However, what happened with Jessica Mann was that she really was not able to go on. She broke down crying, and from what I've understood from the transcripts, she broke down when there was an allusion to a prior sexual assault that she had had earlier in her life, unrelated to Weinstein. And so eliciting that past history and then her having really lose control and not being able to continue, that's kind of emotion that's out of control. It's a little bit of a loose cannon type of emotion, and it can actually undermine her credibility with the jury. It could make her look as being overwrought, traumatized from a previous experience, and really not on point in terms of discussing what happened to her with Weinstein.
And going off that, she's an example of one of the people that we've seen who, after she claims the attack happened and the allegation happened, she still was seeking out Harvey Weinstein's attention. We saw emails, we saw evidence of that. How does that play into this whole thing? Because this often happens with people, victims of sexual assault.
So this is a challenge, and for the prosecution is going to want to look at big picture issues in this trial. They're going to want to say, look, and this has been their strategy, this is a man who committed very similar assaults on women over several decades, and we have a number of victims who can describe and speak eloquently to that. But the defense strategy is going to be, well, let's narrow in on the details. Let's not look at this big picture narrative that the prosecution is trying to sell you. And the more you focus in on the details, you find these things that appear contradictory. Now, the prosecution tried to anticipate this by bringing the forensic psychiatrist, Barbara Ziv, to say that this can be normal and expected with victims, that they will stay in touch with the predator. But for the jury, there's ultimately going to be a question of whether this passes the smell test. Does it pass the smell test for a lay jury, for a not expert jury, that a victim was assaulted by Weinstein and then went and had breakfast with him? Or later that night went to a movie opening with him, or gave him her telephone number. And so what you're going to see with the defense is really focusing on those kinds of details to create doubt in the mind of the jury.
And you talked about the prosecution trying to establish that pattern of behavior with Weinstein. Talk about what we can expect from the defense. We haven't heard them yet. That hopefully may begin tomorrow. But what do you think we can expect? More of this same sort of thing we've seen with the prosecution in calling these witnesses?
So, when the prosecution called their witnesses, the defense really wanted to cross them very intensely, show gaps in memories, inconsistencies, inconsistent behavior, to introduce as much gray into the narrative, shades of gray, make it not black and white. But when they have their own case to present, I think they're going to try to bring other folks who can testify to other sides of Harvey Weinstein. We've heard one side of Harvey Weinstein the last 2 weeks relentlessly. This is a sexual predator who grooms his victims, and he only has one thing on his mind. Now, of course, everyone is multidimensional and has different sides to their personality, so I think we're going to see the defense focus on other sides of his personality, more virtuous, more positive sides of his personality, and maybe particularly bringing women who can speak to a positive relationship that they've had with Harvey Weinstein.
And one of the terms that's been thrown around is that many of his relationships with these women were consensual. Do you think we'll hear a lot about that?
I think we will. I think that, again, in this phase of the trial, they've been trying to throw doubt on the idea that these were non-consensual relationships. And look, one of the challenges here is that this is a really alien world for the jury and for most of us. Hollywood, movie openings, aspiring actresses, scripts, producers, most of us have no real knowledge of this. And so it's a challenge for the prosecution to establish that, when these actresses are in touch with him, that they are truly victims. And so I think that the defense strategy can be, look, this is a complicated industry, and there are complicated relationships that blur the boundaries of personal and professional, and there's a mischaracterization of what was happening here with Weinstein and his victims.
And speaking of Weinstein himself, we've seen him come into the courtroom each day. We usually play that video for you here, but he has a walker typically. He has got someone kind of holding him on his sides, some of his team members there. We've seen him sort of look a little deteriorated, if you will. You know, he had a back surgery we know about, but he always looks a little bit disheveled, perhaps, and old, really, to be honest. What is that image and how they're portraying that mean here?
Well, it's very well known that defense attorneys are going to try to look at the theatrics of their client in the courtroom. And if there's anything that can emphasize a disability or a weakness that could elicit empathy from the courtroom, or which would make the person seem like they couldn't really commit the crimes of which they're accused, then the attorneys are going to want to focus on that. So, he's coming in with a walker. He may very well have orthopedic or back problems, but certainly the walker, it would be a classic type of defense strategy to make him look disabled, to make him look like he's not physically strong enough to overpower these women. And interestingly, we saw the prosecution try to anticipate that, where they have showed pictures on the flat screen TV of a really hulking Harvey Weinstein.
Right.
They've showed him
on the red carpet
exactly.
and him looking kind of glam.
Right. Exactly.
And talking about that, because we're seeing these two images of Weinstein, but we know about this sort of abusive power theme that the narrative as being built throughout this. Women were doing things to get roles. They needed to get ahead in this business. This is a tough thing to get through as a woman, to get these auditions, to get even small, tiny parts. How is the defense really going to poke holes in that argument and maybe even twist it and say these women were using Weinstein?
Right. Well, I think that the defense is going to hammer away at that, and they may even hammer away at the amount of solicitations that he gets from people, strangers, wanting to meet with him and wanting to talk to him, and his vulnerability, allegedly as a powerful person in Hollywood. So I think that this is one of the weaknesses of the prosecution's cases. They're trying to have the women portrayed as victims, and really lacking it. They're getting to the point where they're skirting the line of having the women appear to lack agency. And that doesn't really comport with what we know about these women, that these are ambitious women who really were pursuing their careers. And so it's really going to be up to the jury to decide whether they accept this argument that these women were both ambitious and advocating for themselves and victimized at the same time. And so I think both sides are trying to play on different sides of that story.
Right. It'll be so interesting once the defense starts their case, hopefully tomorrow. Dr. Ziv, one last question. Do you think that we might see Harvey testify?
I really don't think we're going to see Harvey testify. I think that most people would say that the risk that he could make a misstep on the witness stand, or the cross-examination that he would have to cope with by the prosecution, is too risky and outweighs any benefit of having him on the stand. Much better to have him sitting there looking old, decrepit, and letting other people do the talking for him.
All right. Dr. Ziv Cohen, thank you so much, forensic psychiatrist. Pleasure to have you on the show today.